They dragged her out of her own precinct in handcuffs, no Miranda rights, no explanation, while her ID badge lay on the floor and her staff watched in stunned silence. Her name was Danielle Rivers, a respected leader in internal affairs, known for cleaning up the dirtiest corners of the Baltimore Police Department. But one Tuesday morning, the very men she was investigating turned the tables, accusing her of crimes she didn't commit, slamming her to the ground before she could even reach for her wallet. No body cam footage, no security video, or so they thought. What they didn't know was that Danielle had quietly installed a hidden camera months earlier, knowing this day might come. What happens when the accused becomes the accuser? And how does a woman rise from disgrace to dismantle an entire system built to silence her? This is a story of betrayal, courage, and the kind of justice no one saw coming. Stay with us, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel and leave a comment about the moment that hit you hardest. Danielle Rivers had never believed in shortcuts. Born and raised on the east side of Baltimore, she grew up in a two-bedroom apartment above a laundromat, raised by a mother who worked night shifts as a nurse and never once complained. Danielle learned early how to survive in silence, and how to speak up when it counted. From the moment she set her sights on law enforcement, it wasn't just about the badge. It was about justice. Not the kind printed in reports or recited at press conferences, but the kind that walked the beat, called out abuse, and made people uncomfortable when it needed to. She earned her bachelor's from Howard University and a master's in criminal justice before graduating top of her academy class. When she was offered promotions to quieter, easier precincts, she turned them down. Instead, she requested assignment to Baltimore's 8th Precinct, the most problematic in the city. It was a place known not just for misconduct, but for covering it up. To Danielle, that was exactly where she needed to be. At 39, she became the youngest black woman in Maryland history to lead an internal affairs division. But her presence in that old building, with its worn floors and locker room smirks, was never truly accepted. The men she worked beside, like Sergeant Brian Connolly, a third-generation cop who treated his badge like a family heirloom, viewed her success as an insult, not an achievement. Officers like Kyle Riek, the loudmouth rookie eager to please, and Mason Torres, the quiet shadow always backing the loudest voice, weren't just disrespectful. They were dangerous. From day one, Danielle's memos were ignored. Meetings were started without her. Suggestions were mocked. "Maybe you should shadow us first," Connolly once said with a smirk, "see how real police work is done." But she never snapped. She didn't fight back with words, she fought with strategy. What they didn't know was that Danielle had been watching. Studying patterns. Cross-referencing incident reports, recognizing the same excuses: suspect resisted, officer feared for their safety, body cam malfunctioned. The same officers. The same neighborhoods. The same victims. Danielle wasn't just investigating the department. She was preparing for war. But nothing could have prepared her for what came next. On a Tuesday morning, just before a transparency meeting with city officials, Danielle walked into her precinct like she always did, badge clipped to her belt, folder under her arm. And that's when Connolly, Riek, and Torres stopped her. Told her she didn't belong. Accused her of tampering with department systems. Before she could reach for her ID, they tackled her. Slammed her to the ground. Arrested her like a stranger. But Danielle Rivers wasn't just another black woman wrongfully accused. She had a plan. And the camera they didn't know existed? It saw everything. Stay with us for the next chapter, and don't forget to subscribe and share your thoughts in the comments. What would you have done if you were Danielle? The arrest of Danielle Rivers wasn't quiet. A video clip, blurry, grainy, shot on a phone from across the precinct, hit social media by noon. It showed her being dragged through the lobby, her white blouse untucked, wrists cuffed tightly behind her back. There was no context, no backstory, just a single line in the caption: Internal Affairs Director arrested. What did she do? Within hours, local media picked it up. By that evening, her name was splashed across headlines: top official under investigation for departmental tampering. They didn't show the bruises on her arms, or the silence in the cruiser as they refused to read her Miranda rights. They didn't show how the officers laughed on the way to booking, or how she sat alone in the holding cell while a guard rolled his eyes at her every time she asked for a phone call. They didn't show how she kept her head up, not from pride, but survival. Danielle knew how quickly narratives could be twisted, especially when the accused was a black woman in power. She also knew the department wasn't just targeting her, they were sending a message to anyone who dared to challenge them. The betrayal stung deepest when she heard that some of her own staff had whispered things like, maybe she did do something. That uncertainty, that subtle distancing, was the real heartbreak. The next day, she was brought to a private meeting with a city oversight official who didn't bother hiding the weariness in his voice. This isn't about guilt, he told her flatly. It's about optics. The department wants this over. We're prepared to drop all charges if you resign, quietly. No press, no drama. You walk away clean, they walk away clean. He slid a severance agreement across the table like it was mercy. Danielle didn't even touch it. She looked him square in the eye and said, if I resign, they win. And this isn't over. What the city didn't know, what the department never expected, was that Danielle had already been building something. For months, she had quietly collected files, statements, complaints long buried under technical issues. She'd seen the patterns. The lies. The cover-ups. But she didn't just rely on paperwork. After another wrongful use of force case had been dismissed for lack of video, she'd taken it upon herself to install an auxiliary security camera, one that reported to a separate server, one only she controlled. That camera had captured the moment they grabbed her. Her badge clearly visible. Her voice calm. No aggression. No threat. Just 3 officers using brute force on a woman who had done nothing but her job. Now, with the media spinning its own story and City Hall scrambling for damage control, Danielle knew this was her moment, not just to defend herself, but to expose the rot she had quietly mapped from day one. The truth wasn't just coming. It had already been recorded. And Danielle Rivers was ready to play it back. Stay tuned, and if this story hits you, don't leave without hitting subscribe and sharing your thoughts in the comments below. While city officials hoped Danielle Rivers would quietly disappear, she was working in silence, strategic, steady, and more dangerous than ever to those who wronged her. Back at her mother's modest row house in East Baltimore, Danielle transformed the dining table into a war room. Case files, printed emails, red-lined documents, and handwritten notes covered every inch. Her brother Marcus, a local school principal, watched in disbelief. "You're building a case against an entire department," he said one night, shaking his head. Danielle didn't look up. "No," she replied. "I'm building a case against a culture." And she wasn't alone for long. Just days after her suspension, a knock came at the door after sundown. Standing on the stoop was Officer Malik Thompson, a young black rookie from her precinct, barely 2 years on the job. Nervous but determined, he held a thumb drive in one hand and a folder in the other. "I saw what they did to you," he said. "And I know you didn't do what they said." Danielle studied him, not with suspicion, but with care. She knew what it meant to speak up in a place built on silence. "You're risking everything just being here," she said quietly. Malik nodded. "So did you. I guess it's my turn." That night, they sat at the table for hours as he walked her through what he had copied: internal communications, audit logs, patrol schedules that didn't match incident reports, even chat messages between Connolly, Riek, and Torres joking about cleaning house before Danielle could dig too deep. But most important of all, Malik had retrieved backup footage from the hidden auxiliary server Danielle had installed. The footage showed everything. Danielle's calm approach. Her ID badge clearly visible. Her clear verbal warnings. And then, without provocation, the officers surrounding her, tackling her, and handcuffing her. There was no resisting arrest. There was no aggression. There was only truth, recorded from multiple angles, in high definition, time-stamped and impossible to deny. Danielle watched it in silence, pausing and rewinding. Not for revenge, but for accuracy. She wasn't interested in emotional appeals or viral outrage. She wanted facts, strategy, and a courtroom. In the days that followed, more files came in, some from anonymous emails, others slipped under her door. Former officers, concerned citizens, and even one retired captain sent evidence that painted a damning picture. This wasn't just about her arrest. It was a pattern of corruption, falsified reports, deleted footage, threats against officers who challenged the status quo. Danielle didn't want to make noise. She wanted to make it undeniable. She connected with civil rights attorneys and community leaders, not to cry foul, but to prepare a case that could bring down the whole operation. And now, the people who had laughed when she was cuffed were about to face something far more powerful than a press headline, the truth with receipts. If you're ready to see how Danielle flips the entire system on its head, stay with us. And if this part of her journey struck a nerve, subscribe and drop a comment below. We want to hear your voice. The hearing was supposed to be routine, just a procedural review, framed to make Danielle Rivers look like a disgraced official clinging to power. The department expected her to show up defeated, maybe tearful, maybe desperate. But when she entered that courtroom, something in the air shifted. She wore a tailored navy suit, no badge, no uniform, just quiet confidence. Her presence was so steady, so composed, it unsettled even the cockiest officers in the room. Sergeant Connolly sat at the front, flanked by officers Riek and Torres, their expressions rehearsed, their posture smug. They'd spent years thinking themselves untouchable. That illusion was about to shatter. Judge Marlene Cooper tapped her gavel twice, calling the room to order. "We're here today," she began, "to examine the allegations against Director Danielle Rivers, including unauthorized system access, obstruction, and abuse of power." Her tone was firm, but beneath it, a curiosity lingered, one that suggested she knew this hearing would be anything but ordinary. One by one, the officers gave their statements. Connolly spoke with false sincerity about departmental protocol, claiming they acted out of concern. Riek followed, calling Danielle evasive and uncooperative. Torres mumbled something about responding to a report. Each word was carefully chosen to paint Danielle as erratic and suspicious. But she didn't flinch. She didn't even blink. Because she knew what was coming next. When it was her turn to speak, Danielle stood slowly, walked to the center of the room, and met every gaze without apology. "I'm not here to clear my name," she said calmly. "Because it was never truly stained. I'm here to finish what I started." She nodded toward her attorney, who opened a laptop and connected it to the courtroom monitor. With a few keystrokes, the hidden footage began to play. The room went still. There was no narration, no music, just raw video. Danielle walking into the precinct lobby, her badge visible on her hip. Connolly approaching her. Riek flanking her. No signs of aggression. No raised voice. Only her calm attempts to explain herself, and then the sudden, brutal takedown. Gasps filled the room. Judge Cooper leaned forward. Riek's face turned red. Torres looked down at the table. Connolly, for the first time, lost his composure. "That camera wasn't from the department server," Danielle said once the footage ended. "It was installed last year under a pilot program I approved, one that you all didn't know existed." She returned to her seat, then handed over a thick folder to the judge, dozens of reports, statements, signed testimonies. Evidence of systemic abuse, cover-ups, and retaliation. Judge Cooper flipped through the pages, her brow tightening. Within minutes, the judge spoke, effective immediately, "A formal investigation will begin into departmental misconduct. Sergeant Connolly, Officer Riek, and Officer Torres are placed on administrative leave." Danielle stood once more and faced them. "You tried to destroy me in the dark," she said. But I don't live in the dark. I build the light. What happened next would take the city by storm. And if you're ready to see the fallout, and the reckoning that followed, subscribe and leave a comment below. Justice isn't finished yet. The aftermath of Danielle Rivers' courtroom revelation spread like wildfire. Within hours, local news outlets shifted their tone. No longer under investigation, Danielle was now the whistleblower who brought down the precinct. Community groups rallied behind her. Hashtags trended. Former officers began speaking out. But as the public leaned in with support, the political machine began to recoil. The same officials who once praised her quietly moved into damage control mode. And just as she had predicted, the attacks changed form. A national outlet ran an op-ed questioning her motives, asking whether Danielle had acted for justice or personal vengeance. Another piece suggested the footage might have been selectively edited. Political pundits speculated that her actions had created division within the department. And behind closed doors, City Hall was buzzing. Council members debated how to contain the fallout. The mayor, who had conveniently taken a trip to D.C. the night before the hearing, issued a single, tepid line through a spokesperson: "We are reviewing the matter with seriousness and care." Danielle wasn't surprised. She had been in the system long enough to know how it protects itself. But the smear campaign wasn't what troubled her, it was the silence from those who once stood beside her. Colleagues who once called her commander now avoided her name. Former allies hesitated to reach out. Isolation, she realized, was the cost of telling the truth out loud. Still, she stayed focused. Malik, now her most trusted ally, kept her informed. "They're scrambling," he told her during one late-night visit. 3 oversight agencies are auditing precincts across the city. People are resigning. Some are panicking. Danielle only nodded. Let them. One morning, as she sat at her kitchen table, a cold mug of black coffee untouched beside her, she stared at a front-page headline that read, "Hero or Hysteric?" Her brother Marcus paced the living room. "You did everything right," he said. "Gathered the facts. Followed protocol. What more do they want?" Danielle didn't answer right away. Finally, she whispered, "They want a reason to forget what they saw." That same day, she received an official summons from City Hall. No cameras. No press. Just a private meeting with a roomful of senior officials, mostly older white men in dark suits. The mayor wasn't there. Of course not. One councilman leaned forward, his voice polite but firm. "We're concerned with how this was handled, Ms. Rivers. You bypassed the chain of command. You waited to release evidence until it suited you." Another chimed. Danielle took a slow breath, letting the weight of the councilman's words settle before responding. Then, with calm precision, she leaned forward and said, "You're concerned about how I revealed the truth, but not about what that truth actually is." The room went silent. She looked each of them in the eye. "I didn't bypass the chain of command. I bypassed a wall designed to silence people like me. I didn't destabilize the department. The rot did that years ago." They shifted uncomfortably, glancing at each other. One older member tried to regain control of the room. "Let's focus on moving forward. We can't change the past, Ms. Rivers." Danielle stood slowly. "Then let's start with honesty. If you want reform, don't ask me to play politics. Ask me to rebuild what you allowed to collapse." That evening, back at her apartment, she found a thick envelope waiting on her doorstep, official stationery from the police commissioner's office. Inside was an offer, a newly created role, Chief of Internal Accountability. A position with broad powers to oversee investigations, initiate officer terminations, revise training programs, and serve as the public face of reform. The title didn't impress her. The responsibility did. But so did the risk. The very department that once tried to destroy her was now asking her to return and lead it into change. Not as an outsider, not even as an investigator, but as its reformer. She stared at the letter for hours. The offer was historic. No black woman had ever held that kind of authority in Baltimore's police system. But she knew the cost. Walking back into that building wouldn't be a victory lap, it would be a battlefield. Later that night, Malik stopped by, still in uniform, exhaustion in his eyes. He saw the letter on her table and picked it up without a word. After reading it, he looked at her and simply said, "You should take it." Danielle didn't answer immediately. "I didn't fight to be in charge," she finally said. "I fought for change." Malik didn't blink. "So change it, from the inside." His words echoed as she lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling. Could she do it? Could she lead real reform in a place where she had once been dragged out in cuffs? Would they let her succeed, or would they wait for her to fail? The next morning, seeking clarity, Danielle visited the mother of Deshaun Porter, a young man who died 3 years earlier during a routine traffic stop involving officers from the 8th precinct. The case had been quietly closed. Medical incident, the report had said. Danielle always suspected otherwise. Sitting in the quiet living room, Deshaun's mother, Teresa, gripped her hand and asked, "Can you reopen his case?" Danielle nodded. "If I take the job, yes, I can." Teresa's voice cracked. "Then take it. Because they think no one remembers. They think no one cares." By the time Danielle stepped back into her car, the decision was made. And what she did next would change everything. Stay with us, and if you believe in truth, courage, and real reform, subscribe and let us know in the comments what you would have done. Danielle Rivers signed the letter that night. There was no press conference, no parade of flashing cameras. Just a quiet memo posted to the department's internal bulletin and a short press release, Danielle Rivers appointed as Chief of Internal Accountability. No fanfare, just the facts. But facts were all Danielle ever needed. The morning she walked back into the 8th precinct, everything felt different. The same walls. The same badge scanner. But the energy had shifted. Officers who once smirked now looked away. Some nodded respectfully. Others stiffened at the sight of her. The silence wasn't hostile, it was tense, uncertain. It was the silence of people who realized the system had turned, and Danielle Rivers was now standing at its helm. Her new office was on the 2nd floor, past the old break room and the row of lockers where she used to hear whispers about affirmative action hires. Now she passed them with purpose. Her door was glass, intentionally. No more closed rooms. No more secrets. The first person she hired was Malik. Together, they built a team, not based on seniority or politics, but on integrity. Officers who had spoken out in the past. Community liaisons who had fought for transparency. Data analysts who could track misconduct patterns with surgical precision. Danielle's mission wasn't just to investigate wrongdoing. It was to rebuild a culture that had normalized it. Every policy change was logged. Every investigation was made public. Every training program included civilian oversight. For the first time, the department's internal affairs office was no longer feared, it was respected. But it wasn't easy. Files went missing. People forgot to show up for interviews. Some supervisors pushed back in subtle ways, undermining decisions, delaying reforms, issuing advice that was really just veiled warnings. Danielle expected it all. She didn't retaliate. She didn't yell. She documented everything. She let the work speak for itself. 3 months into her new role, she reopened Deshaun Porter's case. This time, with video evidence, timelines, and unedited autopsy records. The ruling was changed, death by excessive force. The city issued a formal apology to Teresa, and a settlement followed, but more important than the money was the acknowledgement. The truth, at last, was official. Teresa used part of the settlement to start a foundation in Deshaun's name, supporting youth education on legal rights and funding legal aid for families facing police misconduct. She and Danielle remained close, bound by shared grief, shared purpose. And while Danielle never sought the spotlight, her work spoke louder than any headline ever could. Former officers were indicted. New recruits were trained with a code of accountability. Transparency wasn't a buzzword anymore, it was policy. One afternoon, standing at a national summit on criminal justice reform, Danielle said it plainly. Justice isn't a destination. It's a decision. Every day. One policy at a time. One truth at a time. And in Baltimore, because of her, it finally began to feel real. If you followed this story to this point, don't leave without hitting subscribe, and share in the comments what justice means to you. The fight isn't over, but the blueprint now exists. In a world that often punishes those who speak out, Danielle Rivers' story reminds us that silence may feel safer, but truth is what truly creates change. Whether in a courtroom, a workplace, or our everyday lives, the courage to stand up against injustice, especially when it's uncomfortable, is what shapes a better future. Real leadership isn't about holding power. It's about using your voice when it matters most, even if you have to stand alone. And as we've seen, sometimes the greatest victories come not from loud battles, but from quiet, steady resolve. If Danielle's journey moved you, made you think, or reminded you of someone in your own life who stood tall against the odds, give this video a like, leave a comment, and subscribe to our channel. We tell these stories for you, because someone out there needs to feel seen, heard, and reminded that they're not alone. You are part of this story now. Let's keep the conversation going.